The boy stood frozen in front of the empty shelves. The place that had once been filled with the music boxes his great-grandmother cherished throughout her entire life, now held nothing but a thin layer of dust resting on aged wood. No one in the room could have imagined that their disappearance would uncover a secret powerful enough to change the entire family. Eleanor Morgan had never been the wealthiest person in Portland. She lived in a modest house at the end of a quiet street lined with old maple trees. She never owned a mansion. She never drove luxury cars. She never took extravagant vacations. Yet for more than 30 years, she quietly built a collection that often left antique collectors astonished. They were vintage music boxes gathered from all over the world. Each one carried a story, a memory, a piece of her life. The person Eleanor loved most was not her children. It was Ethan, her great-grandson, who could spend hours sitting beside her, listening to the delicate melodies drifting from those treasured music boxes. Every visit brought a new story. To Ethan, they were never just antiques. They were memories. They were love. They were a reflection of his great-grandmother herself. After Eleanor passed away, the family gathered at a lawyer's office for the reading of her will. Everyone assumed the collection would be divided among her children. But it was not. Eleanor made a decision that silenced the entire room. She left the entire collection to Ethan. According to her written wishes, he was the only person who truly appreciated what the collection meant. Richard and Susan forced smiles onto their faces. They congratulated their grandson. They acted completely supportive. Since Ethan was still too young, the collection was temporarily stored in their basement. At least, that was what everyone believed. 3 months later, Richard and Susan unexpectedly announced a luxury trip across Europe that would last for several weeks. Claire stared in surprise at the premium travel reservations spread across the dining table. Her parents had been retired for years. Their savings were nowhere near enough to support that kind of lifestyle. When she asked where the money had come from, Richard simply smiled. He said they had sold a few old items they no longer needed. No one asked any further questions. Until the day Ethan wanted to see his great-grandmother's music boxes again. That was the day the truth began to reveal itself. The basement was terrifyingly silent. Ethan moved from one shelf to another as if searching a little harder might somehow bring the familiar music boxes back, but there was nothing. Only long, empty spaces stretching across the wall. Claire turned toward her father. Something in her expression began to change. Richard avoided looking directly at his daughter. At last, he let out a sigh. He admitted that the entire collection had been sold months earlier. Susan immediately rushed to defend the decision. She said they were nothing more than dusty old objects. She said Ethan was too young to understand the real value of money. She said every family eventually had to make practical decisions. But Ethan said nothing. He simply stood in front of the old display cabinet where his great-grandmother had once kept her favorite music box. His eyes slowly filled with tears. Claire could feel her heart tightening. This was not the loss of an object. It felt like someone had stolen a piece of their memories. Then, without warning, Ethan touched the back panel of the bottom drawer. Something seemed lodged inside. He knelt down. His small fingers carefully pulled out a yellowed envelope, worn by time. His name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Eleanor's handwriting. The entire room fell silent. A chill ran down Claire's spine as she opened the letter. The very first line stared back at her. If you are reading this, there is a good chance someone failed to follow my instructions. Richard and Susan immediately exchanged glances. The smiles vanished from their faces. Claire continued reading. With every line, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Eleanor explained that several music boxes in the collection contained hidden notes. Each note represented only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Only by gathering all of them could Ethan unlock a safe deposit box that she had prepared specifically for him. By then, the color had drained from Richard's face. He was beginning to understand that what he had sold might not have been just an antique collection, and whatever came next could be far worse than he had imagined. Claire continued reading the letter in complete silence. Every line Eleanor had written felt like the final piece of a puzzle slowly revealing the entire picture. Inside the safe deposit box were not just financial assets. There were family heirlooms passed down through generations. Antique pocket watches that had been carefully preserved by their ancestors. Investment certificates accumulated over many years. And handwritten letters documenting the history of the Morgan family. Every one of those treasures had been intended for Ethan when he came of age. Susan raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth. Richard sank into the nearest chair. For the first time since the letter had been opened, neither of them could find a single excuse. Because they finally understood one simple truth. What they had sold was not a collection of old objects. It was their grandson's future. The weeks that followed became some of the most stressful the family had ever experienced. Claire contacted attorneys. Lists of buyers were tracked down. Auction houses were contacted. Antique shops were visited one after another. Many of the music boxes had already found their way into the collections of complete strangers. Some owners agreed to return them. Others requested proof of ownership. A few pieces had disappeared entirely. But Eleanor had planned everything far more carefully than anyone could have imagined. The information had been hidden in multiple locations, and after months of determination, Claire finally gathered enough pieces to complete the puzzle Eleanor had left behind. On the day the bank officially confirmed Ethan's inheritance rights, the boy never asked how much the assets were worth. Instead, his first question was whether his great-grandmother's letters were still inside the box. Claire smiled and nodded. Because the most valuable thing Eleanor had left behind had never been money. It was love. It was trust. And it was a lesson Richard and Susan would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Every time they looked at the photographs from that European vacation, they were reminded of what they had truly lost. Not wealth, but the respect of the person who had trusted them most,